The Young and the Restless Spoilers Monday Recap Full Episodes. Victoria Newman had always prided herself on being the steady one, the strategist, the daughter who could look at chaos and immediately begin calculating how to contain it, how to outmaneuver it, how to turn it into something survivable. Yet lately, beneath the polished exterior and the unwavering composure she presented to the world, there had been a growing unease she could neither silence nor rationalize away. It began as a subtle shift, a hesitation in Nick's voice when he insisted he was fine, a flicker in his eyes that did not match the confidence in his words. To anyone else, it might have seemed insignificant, but to Victoria, who had grown up alongside him, fought beside him, and lost alongside him, it was unmistakable. Something was wrong. And no matter how firmly Nick Newman maintained that he had everything under control, the cracks were there, widening with each passing day. The looming threat of Matt Clark only sharpened her fears, turning what might have been a private family concern into something far more dangerous and urgent. Nick had always seen himself as the protector, the one who absorbed the blows so that the rest of the family could stand tall. It was a role he had inherited almost instinctively, forged in the long shadow of Victor Newman, shaped by years of rivalry, reconciliation, and rivalry again, but this time felt different. This time, Nick was not simply confronting a corporate enemy or a rival with a vendetta. Matt Clark was unpredictable, driven by something darker and more personal, and the sense that he was circling the Newman family like a predator waiting for weakness was impossible to ignore. Victoria could see how deeply that knowledge weighed on Nick. He carried it like armor, insisting that as long as he stood between Matt and the family, nothing could touch them. Yet armor, when worn too long, could become suffocating, and lately, Nick looked like a man who was struggling to breathe. Sharon Newman had noticed it too. Her concern was quieter, less analytical than Victoria's, but no less intense. Sharon understood Nick's stubbornness in a way few others could. She knew how deeply his pride ran, how fiercely he resisted the idea of vulnerability. To admit weakness, especially now, would feel like surrendering ground not just to Matt but to every failure Nick had ever carried. So, he insisted he was fine. He insisted the medication he had been taking was simply a temporary measure, a necessary aid to keep him sharp and focused in the face of mounting pressure. But both Victoria and Sharon sensed that the painkillers were no longer just about physical relief. They were becoming a shield against something else: fear, exhaustion, doubt. When Victoria finally decided to speak with Nicky, it was not out of panic but calculation. She understood that if anyone could see past Nick's defenses, it would be their mother. Nicky Newman had witnessed every version of her son, the rebellious young man defying his father, the devoted husband, the wounded brother, the determined executive. She knew the difference between strength and denial, and yet, as Victoria entered Nicky's office, she was struck by the realization that even Nicky might be unprepared for what was unfolding. Their conversation began, as expected, with Matt Clark. The threat he posed was impossible to ignore, and Nicky's expression hardened at the mere mention of his name. The Newman family had survived countless adversaries, but the unpredictability of this one made him uniquely dangerous. Nicky spoke with the calm authority of someone who had endured worse, yet Victoria detected a tension beneath her words. Matt was not simply targeting their business interests, he was targeting their sense of security, and Nick, in his determination to stop him, was walking directly into the line of fire. It was only after they had dissected every possible angle of Matt's latest moves that Victoria allowed the conversation to shift. She spoke carefully, choosing her words with precision, explaining that her concern was not just about the external threat but about Nick himself. She described the changes she had observed, the way his focus sometimes faltered, the defensiveness that flared whenever the subject of his medication arose. Nicky listened in silence, her composure unshaken, but her eyes betrayed recognition. She had noticed it too. Nicky admitted, with reluctant honesty, that she had sensed something off about her son, a hesitation, a slight delay in his reactions, moments when his usual sharp instincts seemed dulled. She had attributed it, at first, to stress. After all, Nick was carrying an enormous burden. But the more she watched him, the harder it became to dismiss the possibility that the painkillers were no longer just a tool but a crutch. The irony was not lost on Nicky. She, of all people, understood the slippery slope of dependency. The Newman family had weathered addiction before. They knew how easily strength could be undermined by denial. Yet knowing was not the same as acting. Convincing Nick to admit he had a problem would be another battle entirely. He was laser-focused on one objective, stopping Matt Clark before he could cause irreversible damage. In Nick's mind, any discussion of intervention would only distract from that mission. He would see it as a lack of faith, an accusation that he was not capable of protecting those he loved. And for Nick, that was unbearable. Victoria found herself torn between urgency and strategy. On one hand, she feared that waiting could allow the problem to escalate. On the other, confronting Nick now, while Matt remained at large, could push him further into isolation. He might double down, take greater risks, and refuse help entirely. The timing had to be precise. An intervention launched too soon could fracture the fragile unity they needed to face their external enemy. But delaying too long could mean watching Nick spiral beyond their reach. As mother and daughter weighed their options, the underlying truth remained unspoken but palpable. The Newman family was standing on the edge of something catastrophic. Matt Clark was a visible threat, one they could strategize against, gather intelligence on, and counter with force. But Nick's internal struggle was more insidious. It was quiet, concealed behind reassurances and determined smiles. It was the kind of danger that did not announce itself until it was too late. Victoria left her meeting with Nicky with more questions than answers. She resolved to keep a closer watch on her brother, to look for signs that the balance was tipping further. She could not shake the feeling that Nick was walking a razor's edge, juggling vengeance, responsibility, and a dependence he refused to acknowledge. The image of him standing alone, convinced that he was the only one strong enough to face Matt, haunted her. Nick, meanwhile, remained unwavering in his mission. Every conversation circled back to strategy, to contingency plans, to the next move Matt might make. He dismissed concerns with a wave of his hand, attributing any perceived change in his behavior to exhaustion. He insisted he could handle it, and perhaps, in some ways, he could. But the combination of relentless stress and reliance on medication was a volatile mix. The more he insisted he was in control, the more Victoria feared he was losing it. There was a dangerous symmetry forming, Matt Clark applying pressure from the outside, and the painkillers eroding Nick's clarity from within. If one did not break him, the other might. And the tragedy would be that Nick would not see it coming. He would believe he was acting out of strength, out of loyalty, out of love for his family. He would tell himself that every risk was justified, every sleepless night necessary. Victoria could only hope that when the moment came when Matt's threat either escalated or finally subsided, they would still have time to reach Nick. She feared that in his determination to end the terror looming over them, he might make a choice he could not undo. A decision fueled not by clear judgment but by a desperate need to prove he was still the unbreakable protector. And if that happened, the cost would not just be his own well-being. It would reverberate through the entire Newman family, reopening wounds they had fought so hard to heal. The question that lingered, heavy and unrelenting, was not whether Nick could stop Matt Clark. It was whether he could stop himself before everything he was trying to protect slipped through his fingers. Sally Spectra had always understood that survival required reinvention. Long before she found herself entangled in the complicated emotional and corporate web of Genoa City, she had learned that vulnerability could be both a weapon and a liability. Her past was not simply a collection of mistakes, it was a pattern of calculated risks, desperate gambits, and moments of raw ambition that sometimes blurred the line between courage and recklessness. When Audra Charles attempted to block Sally from meeting with Billy Abbott, it was not merely a territorial move or a passing disagreement. It was a collision between two women who recognized ambition in each other and understood how dangerous that ambition could become when paired with the wrong ally. Audra knew Billy's history of instability, his impulsive swings between brilliance and self-destructs. And she likely believed she was protecting Sally from stepping into a dynamic that would eventually consume her. Yet Sally, driven by curiosity and perhaps by an instinctive refusal to be controlled, chose to meet Billy anyway. And that decision altered the trajectory of more than one relationship in ways none of them could fully predict. When Sally finally opened up to Billy about her past, the moment was not dramatic in the traditional sense. There were no grand declarations or theatrical confessions. Instead, there was something quieter, more dangerous: honesty. She spoke about the choices that had followed her like shadows, about the miscalculations that cost her trust and credibility, about the hunger for success that sometimes led her to cut corners she later regretted. For Billy, who had spent years wrestling with his own demons, there was something disarming about her candor. He recognized the self-awareness in her voice, the tension between regret and defiance. Their connection, at least on the surface, felt genuine. It was built not on illusion but on shared scars. They were two people who understood what it meant to fall from grace and attempt to climb back with dignity intact. In those moments, their chemistry felt natural, almost inevitable, as if the universe had aligned to restless spirits searching for validation in each other's eyes. And yet, chemistry and confession are not foundations strong enough to support the weight of unresolved ambition. The issues between Sally and Billy were not the kind that could be neatly resolved in a single conversation, no matter how heartfelt. They were structural differences, embedded in their very definitions of success. For Sally, success was redemption. It was proof that she could rise above her past, that she could build something legitimate and lasting without resorting to manipulation. For Billy, success was rebellion. It was a statement against expectations, a refusal to conform to the rigid standards set by legacy and family. These differences were subtle at first, masked by attraction and mutual admiration, but they lingered beneath every shared smile. Sally wanted stability disguised as opportunity, while Billy craved chaos disguised as freedom. Over time, those opposing instincts threatened to pull them in directions neither fully anticipated. There was also something unsettling about Billy when he was around Sally, a flicker of intensity that bordered on obsession. It was not overtly threatening, but it carried a weight that could not be ignored. Billy had a tendency to latch onto ideas, projects, and even people with a fervor that burned too bright and too fast. Around Sally, that energy intensified. He seemed determined not only to support her but to anchor himself through her, as if she represented a second chance at purpose. To some, that might have appeared romantic. To others, it felt precarious. Sally, perceptive as ever, sensed the undercurrent. She understood that being someone's redemption could quickly turn into being someone's crutch. And she had no intention of becoming another casualty of a man's unresolved inner war. Meanwhile, in a different corner of Genoa City's intricate social landscape, Holden was grappling with his own unraveling. Claire Grace Newman's decision to end their relationship was not impulsive. It was calculated, rooted in a growing realization that their paths were diverging. Claire, fiercely independent and deeply aware of the Newman legacy that shaped her identity, refused to tolerate half-truths or divided loyalties. Her breakup with Holden was a declaration of self-respect, but it also created a vacuum, one that unexpectedly made it easier for Holden to continue protecting Audra's secrets. With Claire no longer by his side, the risk of exposure diminished, at least superficially, yet emotional consequences rarely align with logistical convenience. The more Holden distanced himself from Claire, the more entangled he became in Audra's orbit. Holden's repeated sacrifices for Audra raised questions that even he might have struggled to answer. What exactly had he done this time to shield her from fallout? Had he taken the blame for a misstep, buried evidence that could have implicated her, or redirected suspicion at his own expense? The specifics mattered less than the pattern. Again and again, Holden placed himself in vulnerable positions to ensure Audra emerged unscathed. It was not merely loyalty, it bordered on devotion. Observers could not help but wonder whether his actions were fueled by unspoken love. There was a tenderness in the way he defended her, a quiet resolve that suggested his motivations ran deeper than friendship. Yet Audra, pragmatic and fiercely self-reliant, rarely allowed herself to acknowledge the emotional implications of his sacrifices. She valued him, certainly. She relied on him. But whether she truly comprehended the cost he paid on her behalf remained uncertain. The dynamic between Audra and Holden possessed an undeniable rhythm. They moved around each other with familiarity, their exchanges layered with shared history and mutual understanding. In many ways, they appeared more compatible than Claire and Holden ever had. Audra challenged him intellectually, matched his ambition with her own, and understood the delicate balance between risk and reward. Where Claire sought clarity and moral alignment, Audra operated in shades of gray, For Holden, drawn to complexity, that ambiguity was intoxicating. It allowed him to feel necessary, even heroic, in ways a straightforward relationship never could. And yet, that very ambiguity carried the seeds of future conflict. Because the more he gave to Audra, the more he risked losing himself. Claire, on the other hand, wasn't likely to accept her exclusion from the narrative quietly. Her breakup with Holden did not erase the emotional residue of betrayal, especially if she were to discover the extent of his involvement in protecting Audra. The potential for a renewed feud loomed on the horizon. Claire's pride, combined with the Newman instinct for strategic retaliation, could transform personal heartbreak into calculated opposition. If she perceived Holden's actions as a direct affront to her trust, she would not hesitate to respond. And in doing so, she might inadvertently expose vulnerabilities that Audra had worked tirelessly to conceal. The interplay between these relationships created a web of tension that extended beyond romance. Sally and Billy's fragile alignment, Audra and Holden's charged loyalty, Claire's simmering resentment, each thread tugged at the others. Genoa City thrived on such entanglements, where personal decisions reverberated through professional alliances and familial loyalties. Sally's willingness to confront her past, Billy's restless hunger for purpose, Holden's sacrificial devotion, and Audra's guarded ambition were not isolated character traits. They were catalysts, poised to ignite unforeseen consequences. There was an almost poetic symmetry in how these storylines mirrored one another. Sally risked emotional exposure to build something authentic with Billy, even as structural incompatibilities threatened their foundation. Holden risked reputation and stability to shield Audra, even as unacknowledged feelings complicated his motives. Both narratives explored the cost of loyalty and the peril of misaligned expectations. Both questioned whether transparency could coexist with ambition, and both hinted at inevitable reckoning. For now, the alliances held. Sally and Billy continued to explore their connection, buoyed by shared vulnerability yet shadowed by divergent definitions of success. Audra and Holden maintained their delicate balance, bound by trust yet teetering on the edge of emotional revelation. Claire watched from a distance, her composure masking the storm beneath. But in Genoa City, equilibrium is rarely permanent. The very qualities that draw people together often become the fractures that drive them apart. Whether Holden's sacrifices will deepen Audra's appreciation or awaken feelings she has long suppressed remains uncertain. Whether Sally and Billy can reconcile ambition with compatibility is equally unclear. What is certain is that beneath the surface of these evolving relationships lies a tension too potent to remain contained, and when it finally erupts, it will reshape not only who stands together but who is left standing at all.